Okay, let's get to our panel. Joining me now here in the studio is Song Zhang. He is the chief correspondent with the Shanghai Wenhui Daily in Washington, D.C. With me here too is Saurabh Gupta. He is a senior fellow at the Institute for China-America Studies. Joining us from Beijing is Victor Gao. He is a Chinese international relations expert. And with us here in the studio as well is Saranand Dume. He is a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Welcome to all of you to the show. Saranand, let me start with you. China has accused India of using the protection of Bhutan as an excuse to stage this incursion into Chinese territory. What is India's position on the standoff?
Now, this is viewed very differently in India. Now, broadly speaking, the Indian position kind of comes, it's twofold. The first is that though this is a disputed territory between Bhutan and China, and not between India and China, India has a very close relationship with Bhutan and has been called in by the Bhutanese to assist. That's the first part. The second is that what Indians see as the flashpoint over here is China changing the status quo by building a road in this disputed territory. If there had been no road in this disputed territory, then the Bhutanese would not have called upon India for assistance. If that had not happened, Indian troops wouldn't be there. Now, the reason this is very strategic for India and why this matters so much is that this is a part of the border that is very close to a place called, known colloquially as the so-called Chicken's Neck, which is a sort of narrow strip of territory that connects India's northeast to the rest of the country. So the strategic implications of this road being built over there, while negotiations are going on to sort of settle the final status of this, obviously is quite high.
So is the Indian concern that China, by building this road, is putting certain facts on the ground which
Absolutely.
might not be in dispute later?
Exactly. It's putting facts on the ground, and it is changing the military situation on the ground. And it is also, in the Indian view, doing this when, in fact, there is an agreement that on issues of the so-called tri-junction, which affect India, China, and Bhutan, the three countries should come to some agreement.
Okay, let's go to Victor in Beijing. And Victor, this area where China says there was an incursion is called Doklam. China says its sovereignty over this area dates back to a treaty it signed with Britain in 1890. What are China's main concerns right now?
Well, first of all, the Chinese side is very clear about this particular area belonging to China, citing all the way to the 1890 treaty involving China, the then British Indian Empire, and the Kingdom of Sikkim and China's Tibet. And the Indian side originally cited kind of territorial dispute between Sikkim and China, which completely fell apart. Now, the Indian side is using the so-called territorial disputes between the Kingdom of Bhutan and China and using that as an excuse to send its troops into this particular area that China claims to be the Chinese territory. Now, if the Indian side really wants to build up this case of sending its troops to the Chinese side of the border, occupying that for many, many days in a row, then the argument on the Indian side is very, very flimsy. Further, if the Chinese build a road in the Chinese side of the territory and the Indian side will claim being threatened by the road building, then I will say China will keep building more roads to the Chinese side of the border, and the Indian side will need to be frightened again and again. If you look at the international situation, a country has the right to build a road within its own territory. Therefore, I think it is time for India to wake up to the reality and to withdraw its troops. The longer it keeps its troops in this particular area, the more likely that this will trigger a confrontation between China and India at a time when neither China nor India can better serve itself or its own people if a military confrontation breaks out in that particular area.
Right, I get your point, Victor, about a country being entitled to build a road or any other thing on its territory, but this, as Saranand pointed out, is territory that's in dispute.
No, I don't think so. I think from the Chinese perspective, the Kingdom of Bhutan is a sovereign state, has its own independence, and India has no right to treat the Kingdom of Bhutan as a protective state and sending its troops into the Chinese side of the territory by using Bhutan as an excuse. Because if this is the case that India wants to use, then there are many, many areas where war or confrontation may break out. For example, China and Pakistan are building transportation connectivity projects through part of the Pakistani side of Kashmir, which India claims to be Indian. Does this give right to India to send its troops to the Pakistani-occupied part of Kashmir to disrupt the Chinese-Pakistani efforts to build highways and railways and other connectivity projects over there? No, it doesn't give India any reason or any right to do that, because otherwise the international law will be completely trampled and there will be no peace or stability throughout the world, and war will become the rule of thumb rather than peace and stability and diplomacy.
Saurabh, so we have a standoff right now, growing tensions. China is demanding the immediate withdrawal of these Indian troops. How serious is this?
I think this is fairly serious because the bottom line, as Victor said, is Indian troops have no locus standi to be in that part where they are across the border. So China can unilaterally demand that India unilaterally move troops back without any payment. If there is something to be discussed or negotiated, that is between China and Bhutan, and that happens on a separate track. So at this point of time, China-India relations have been on a downward spiral. So China is the aggrieved party out here. It can stay the aggrieved party out here, and it can demand that India move troops back, or the relationship will deteriorate. They will set a floor, of course, but it will deteriorate. And India doesn't have ground to demand a sort of diplomatic payment in exchange, because, as I said, that is between China and Bhutan to manage by way of some sort of boundary management protocol.
Song, this is a long-running dispute, this border dispute. China, India, and Bhutan have disputed this area. There have been negotiations between China and Bhutan since the 1980s. There have been something like 24 rounds of talks. What is the status of those negotiations right now?
Let me give you one example. I was in Nepal for 9 years, and China and Nepal fixed their border in 1962. And I don't think these border talks between Bhutan and China will have a conclusion anytime soon, because I think, Bhutan is having no diplomatic relationship with China, with America, with Britain, and many other big countries in the world. And so I think as long as Delhi is saying that you need to hold until the border issue between China and India will be solved, you cannot seal the agreement with Chinese side. I think that is the fundamental reason why we have 24 rounds of talks and we cannot fix this border issue.
Saranam, the Indian Foreign Secretary recently called for a de-escalation of tensions in the area. He said differences should not be allowed to become disputes. Is that a hopeful sign that this could be resolved?
I think one of the most striking things about this particular standoff is the difference in tone and rhetoric. What you're seeing emanating from Beijing, both in terms of what you're hearing from the foreign ministry, but also what you're hearing from state-controlled or state-linked media, is a great deal of belligerence and a sort of black and white view of this, that, we are in the right and we've been wronged, and the sort of things that Saurabh was sort of echoing in his comments. I think the view from India has been much more muted, much more mature in my view. They've said, listen, look, there are disputes. We've had disputes before. We will have disputes in the future also. The way to deal with these is to talk them through. The way to deal with this is not to amp up the rhetoric, threaten war on other fronts, and that sort of thing, which is quite unusual and quite striking, because in the past, both countries actually have had a pretty good record of managing these things. So they may not have necessarily come to some kind of conclusion on the disputed border, but this is a border where there hasn't been a shot fired in anger in 40 years. And that proves that both the Chinese and the Indians have managed to sort of deal with some of these delicate disputes with a degree of maturity. And I would hope, and I think that is what the Foreign Secretary of India was sort of suggesting in his comments, that again, a sort of sense of maturity and a sense of the long view, that it makes no sense for these two countries. I agree with Victor there. It makes no sense for these countries to get into a military confrontation. And frankly, it makes no sense from the Chinese perspective to be positioned in the eyes of the Indian public as a hostile country, which has never been the case, even after the 1962 war for most Indians. And I would imagine, though I'm not an expert on how the Chinese view Indians, that there would be an interest also in China not to sort of unnecessarily sort of take this and turn it into something that is larger than it needs to be.
Right, Victor, what is your view on this? Will diplomacy prevail? Is there time right now to lower the temperature?
No, first of all, while I have full respect for the other panelist who just now made his comment, I strongly disagree with the premise of his argument, and I found the premise very much hypocritical. Now, in the world today, if you believe that a foreign country sends its troops into your side of the territory, occupies that for weeks in a row, refuses to withdraw the troops out of your country and back into his own country, and then you call it moderation? No, I think any other country in China's situation would send troops to drive out the Indian invasion troops. I think China has been very tolerant. China does not want to fire the first shot. China has been urging the Indian side to use all its wisdom and courage and vision to withdraw the troops. And the longer India keeps its troops on the Chinese soil, the more India will eventually lose. And I think it may be time for China and other countries to demand that the Kingdom of Bhutan really be treated as an independent country with full right. Why shouldn't Bhutan establish diplomatic relations with the United States, with China? Why should India control the visas that the Kingdom of Bhutan can issue to international tourists? This is unfair treatment of the Kingdom of Bhutan. And what India is doing may be a repetition of the annexation of the former Kingdom of Sikkim. So I think India needs to really be a very responsible country, treat Bhutan as an equal, sovereign, fully independent country, rather than mishandling Bhutan as if it is part of India. Bhutan is an independent country with full sovereign right, and India should treat that as it is.
Okay, I want to take a break, but Saranan, I want to give you a chance to quickly respond to that.
Well, I mean, I think that, I think Victor's sort of, rhetoric really points to exactly the point I'm raising. This is, first of all, to frame this in such starkly black and white terms presupposes that this is not a dispute. The fact is that this is disputed territory. This is acknowledged as disputed territory. Now, the Chinese obviously are not going to agree with the Bhutanese claim. That is understandable. But there is a Bhutanese claim. Now, the second point about sort of India-Bhutan relations, the point is well taken, but I think it's for the Bhutanese to decide what the nature of their relationship with India will be. And the Bhutanese have very clearly, in this case, they feel threatened, and they have called upon India. They have made an official statement through their foreign ministry.
Right.
So this idea that, that third countries should sort of should determine what the Bhutanese see as their own interest, I think is simply not true.